Hey, everybody, I'm Deb Gabor. I am the author of Branding is Sex and Irrational Loyalty and the host of Brand New World. We weren't here last week because of a devastating snowstorm in Texas, and several of our team were without power. So I'm sorry we missed you last week, but I'm so glad to be here this week. I want to tell you, I have a very, very special guest today, and this is Andy Cunningham. Andy Cunningham is just a marketing and communications and strategy superstar. Back in the day when I had a job, this was the last time I actually had a job, I worked for Andy, and she's somebody that I really, really looked up to. I learned a ton from her over the couple of years that I worked for Cunningham Communication, which then became Citygate Cunningham at that time. And then I've been following her career ever since. She's kind of been this mentor from afar from me, but somebody that I've really, really admired. She wrote this great book called Get to Aha that I make a lot of our clients read. And so if you're a client out there and you're watching and I made you read this book because I needed you to make some hard decisions, remember our core value of we do hard things. And branding is hard and you have to choose things. This was part of your choosing. But anyway, I really, really wanted to bring her on this show and talk to her about what's been going on for the last 18 years, because that's the last time we worked together. Talk about this book, talk about the intersection of positioning and branding and how they are alike and how they are different, and then just generally catch up with her. So if you are Cunningham alumni and you're watching this, please give us some comments on Facebook Live or LinkedIn Live, and we'll make sure that we give you a shout out. So let's bring Andy into the room, Tom. Hello, how are you?
Hey, Deb, so good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so pleased that you're here. So you heard me say that I make a lot of our clients read your book.
Yes, and thank you so much, because now I'm in the book selling business, so I appreciate that.
That's right. Yes, being in the book selling business, I'm also in the book selling business. I would like to sell a whole lot more books, but for right now, the book is a good sort of top of funnel activity for me. But let's talk a little bit about you. So I mentioned how we met. I think that I started at Cunningham Communication in the Austin office back in like 1999. I mean, it was like it was 2 decades ago. It was a million years ago. Like probably 1999, and that's when the organization was set up that had a bunch of these different sort of operating groups. And I came in through the Cunningham Ventures group. Do you remember that?
Yep, I sure do.
Yeah. And so one of the interesting things that we worked on together there was Eclipse Aviation.
Oh,
and yeah. And so that's where I got to know about your passion for aviation and, just everything about aviation, which is something that I came to the table not knowing much about. So, I'm grateful that you exposed me to interesting people like Vern.
Vern was quite the case. And Vern, we took that company from cradle to grave, if you might recall. 12 years of marketing for those guys. So
yeah. I mean, it was an interesting value proposition, the sub $1 million jet with the interchangeable engines and, using this network of fixed base operators and regional airports and kind of changing the idea of air travel. You have always been a person who was super visionary about, disruption and changing the nature of markets and things like that. That's something that I've observed.
Yes, I love, I learned early on that I love using language to get people, to influence people, right? To influence their thinking, their buying patterns, all of that stuff. So I love that. Not in a bad way, in a good way.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about Andy, for people in this network who don't know who she is that she has a fascinating claim to fame. And, one of the cool things is she helped Steve Jobs launch the Macintosh. Can you talk just a little bit about that? Because I think it's for people in our industry, like this is, I hate to say it, it's like part of the folklore of the industry. And we always point back to that event and that launch and sort of the movement that started as an example of, here's how it's done. What can you share with our audience about that were big learnings?
Sure. So first I'm going to say that Steve's birthday was just the other day. He would have been 67 6. And there was a big clubhouse event about Steve, and I got to be a speaker on it. There were 3,300 people on that call, and there were probably 6 or 7 speakers, and we all got to tell stories about Steve. It was really quite an emotional thing for everyone because many of us had worked with him. But anyway, kind of the interesting thing about Steve is, first of all, he completely formed my thinking about marketing and about disruption. Of course, we didn't use that word back then, but that's what he was all about. And I remember, I'll just tell one quick story about when he got kicked out of Apple. That's when I decided to start my own agency. So he was fired and he went off. And then I said to Regis, who was my boss at the time, Regis McKenna, and my mentor, I said, Regis, I think it's time for me to start my own thing. He was wonderful about it. I left. I got all my stuff out on my kitchen table, started my business, and literally 2 weeks later, I get a call from Steve saying, hey, I'm starting this new company. And I'm having a press conference at my house in about an hour. Do you think you can come over and help me? I'm like, in an hour? What are you going to announce? Anyway, I drove over to his house in Woodside, and like the lore says, there was not a stick of furniture anywhere. I drive up to the place in Woodside, California, and there are 50 or so business press journalists just milling around his yard, Fortune, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Chronicle, the whole 9 yards. I kind of get myself inside of the kitchen. I open the door, and Steve and 7 people are sitting in a semicircle on the floor in his kitchen because, again, there's no furniture. So I'm now standing and they're all sitting, and I say, so what's going on, Steve? He goes, I'm going to announce my new company. I'm founding this new company. I'm going to call it Next. I'm taking these 6 people from Apple Computer. They're going to come with me. And his lawyer was also sitting there. That was the 7th person. And we're going to announce the new company. And I'm also going to tell the world what a jerk John Scully is. And I'm like,
boy.
I'm like, what? And I'm looking at the lawyer, and he's, like many people around Steve, his eyes were glazed over, his mouth was hung open. He was kind of starstruck by Steve. So I just looked at Steve and I said, you can't do that. You can't make that announcement. And he goes, why not? And I said, because A, you haven't really left Apple yet. You haven't, your deal isn't done yet. B, these people, you can't just steal them from Apple. I'm sure there's going to be something in a contract that's going to prevent you from doing that. And the third thing is you don't have anything to announce. And you can't say bad things about John Scully. That would really be a bad thing to do. So anyway, and by the way, John was on the Clubhouse call the other night saying wonderful things about Steve. So it all ended up good. But anyway, so Steve kind of folds his arm, closes his eyes, and he goes, okay, I won't do it, but you've got to go out there and get rid of everybody. So I went out into the yard, and I basically, here's the secret to good PR: tell the truth, right? So I basically just said to everybody, hey, here's the thing. He just left Apple, 2 weeks ago. He doesn't have a product. He thinks he knows what he wants to do. We got a name for the company. That's it. We got nothing else. So we're not going to say anything today, but I promise you, every single one of you will be included as soon as there is something to announce. So please go home. And they grumbled and mumbled, but they all did go home. And then I wound up in the Herb Cain column the next day at the San Francisco Chronicle, if anybody remembers Herb Cain, who was
I do, yes,
as old as my think sign back here. Herb Cain called me the dumb flack that made everybody go home at Steve Jobs' press conference. So I have the honor of being called a dumb flack by Herb Cain, and that's my claim to fame. But anyway.
And you carried that into your life, and, it sort of formulated the entire trajectory of your career, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Flack. I love it. So anyway, I ended, that was the beginning of another relationship with Steve Jobs, with Next and with Pixar. I got to launch Pixar as well. And just a quick thing about Pixar. Pixar didn't start off being a storytelling company. It was a computer. It was a graphics rendering engine. And it was Steve's vision and brilliance that saw this fellow in the back, who was what we used to call a demo jockey, whose name was John Lasseter. And he saw the potential there. And he basically helped turn the company into a storytelling company, which is the legacy it is today. So anyway, Pixar was very cool.
That's awesome. So one of the things that you said, in that story about like having to go out and send all of the business press and tech press away, you said, just tell the truth, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you remember this, but I came to PR from marketing and research and strategy, not from PR. And I kind of learned PR on the job, right?
Right.
And one of the big things that I learned was like, just tell the truth. And I learned a bunch of rules about communication and a bunch of rules about mitigating crisis. And that actually, like those learnings that I got while I was at Cunningham Communication and learning about those various things, with the key thing being like, just tell the truth, that actually forms the foundation of my book, Irrational Loyalty.
Oh, that's awesome, Deb.
The
True, right?
thesis. Yeah, go ahead.
I just say truth will set you free, no matter what your business is. Yeah.
And it's interesting because that book that I wrote, actually the book kind of wrote itself over the course of about late 2015 until 2018. And it was really based on like all of the interviews and op-eds and things like that I had written about, like high profile brand implosions and brand disasters.
Oh, wow.
I examined like, what are all of the things that are in common among the brands that have the power to endure the greatest crises. And one of the key tenets of that is they tell the truth, they're authentic, they show regard for humanity, they take accountability, they apologize, they communicate, here's a roadmap and a plan, they meet all of their deadlines, even if they're not like delivering on whatever that promise is, they're still communicating in a proactive way. So that's kind of fun. But I learned all of that while working for you. I don't know if you know that, but anyway,
that's so cool. But I did want to say this in the beginning of this call. I am so proud of you and what you've done. It is so cool to me to have somebody like you having spent time working with us and doing what you're doing today. So bravo.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. And then other story, I don't know if I told you this when we had our pre-meeting. So the title of this book, Branding is Sex, yes. This actually came from my work at Cunningham
so I can take credit for that.
Yeah, you can take credit for that too, because like I'm the person who's brave enough to use both the word sex and laid in the title of a book. But that actually came from my work with Sun Microsystems.
Oh yeah,
which I ran one of the Sun Microsystems accounts, and I think I was doing like executive communication for the launch of a server operating system. Nothing sexy about that, right?
Right.
And I remember being really, really frustrated with like trying to help these executives with really solid storytelling. And then, sitting face to face and saying, okay, at the end of the day, how does this server operating system get that IT guy laid? And then having this huge breakthrough in the room. And they were like, oh, I can tell you exactly how it gets that guy laid. And I was like, all right, now here we go. We've got a very clear value proposition that's inclusive of the customer. Let's move on. So that story actually is like where Branding is Sex came from. So you are part of like the trajectory of my career, and you didn't even know it.
I did not know it, but I'm very happy that I am. And I think the title is awesome of that book. I love it.
Oh, well, thank you. That one flies off the shelf. Yes. Yeah, totally. All right. I want to switch gears a little bit. So we talked a little bit about you and your claim to fame, and that story story about Steve Jobs and the non-launch of Next and things like that is really, it's really fun. I want to talk about your book a little bit.
Ah, cool.
Get to Aha. So I mentioned at the beginning, I make a lot of our clients read this book, and actually our team created, I think, either a Typeform or Google Forms quiz where we make clients actually, when they're really, really struggling with making difficult choices about who they want to be and how they want to be positioned in the conceptual space that they're going to occupy in their markets. I make them read the book. I make them do the quizzes that are in the book. We turned them into interactive forms. We send them out to their executive teams. We gather the information. We help them understand where they're on the same page, where they're not, and we help them build alignment using these concepts. I want you to share with everybody, like, what is the thesis of this book, and what is positioning?
Oh, well, thank you, Deb. That's a great question. So I suppose that the underlying thesis of all of it is that companies are like people. They're made up of people. They serve people. People make the products that they deliver. It's all about people. So you have to treat them You have to create brands for them, just like you would for a person, and understanding that a person has a rational side to their brain and an emotional side. Companies also have a rational side and an emotional side. And like people, if you're going to do some marketing for that person, or anything, any action that you're going to take as a human being, it's best to think about your rational side first before you constantly jump in with your emotional side. So our big premise is do the positioning first before you do the branding, because it will inform what you do with the branding, and it will be much more logical, and it'll make a whole lot more sense. So that's the underlying premise of it. And then the whole book talks about what are the steps you need to take to figure out the answer to those two questions you just mentioned, which is who are you and why do you matter? And those are tough questions.
They're very difficult questions. Define, if you will, for people watching, what is positioning? Because I hear all the time positioning and branding being used interchangeably. And one of the things that I heard you say here is like that rational side and the emotional side. And I feel like I know what the difference is, but how would you express that to other people who are maybe new to this?
Sure. So positioning is the definition of your point on the map, the little white space that you own that defines your role and relevance. It is a very factual statement. There's no adjectives in it. There's no fluff in it. There's no sex in it. It's basically a very factual statement about the place that you own on the map. And the hard part about positioning is finding that place, right? Finding that place that only you can own in a compelling way, and then articulating it. So that's positioning. Branding is the emotional part that once you know what your position is, branding is now, okay, now you have to sell that thing to someone, and people, no matter whether they're B2B or B2C, or as I call B2P, business to people, no matter what you're selling or who you're selling it to, there's an emotion that happens with that buyer. And you have to identify what that emotion is. You have to figure out how to elicit it. And then you have to make it come to life with that customer so that they will become attracted to your product, whether you're selling IT software or Manolo Blahnik shoes.
Exactly. Can you give an example of maybe a well-known organization and how you would articulate their positioning versus maybe the emotional side of their brand?
Sure. So I'll give you an example of a company we just launched. It's kind of relevant because it's a COVID company. So this was a medical diagnostics company that was working on a technology for 7 years to speaking of sex, to deal with sexually transmitted diseases, to diagnose them at home. So their idea was to create a product that you could, like a pregnancy test, that you could test for these things at home and not have to go to a lab. But the cool thing, or the interesting and the cool thing about this, is that it had to be PCR. Now you hear about all this PCR testing with COVID, right? PCR is the most trusted and the most reliable testing mechanism for any kind of infectious disease, whether it's sexually transmitted or whether it's COVID. So when you go out and get a test for COVID, the best ones are PCR tests. But PCR tests involve going to a lab. You do your thing, you do your swab, and then it has to go to a lab. It has to be in the queue at the lab. The lab machine that does this is probably 8 feet by 10 feet. And it takes several days. Well, in the middle of a pandemic like COVID, that doesn't work so well. You need to get testing out faster. So what these guys did is they pivoted their technology from sexually transmitted diseases to COVID, and they created, and here's the positioning, they created a pocket PCR, which is about this big. So they took that giant lab device and took it and made it into something this big. And so we called it a pocket PCR, which indicated that you could use this at home and that it was small and that it was PCR. So that was positioning for those guys. And they have now got what's called their point of care authorization from the FDA, which means they are now allowed to use the device in places like football games or things like that. So testing is very critical for COVID, and positioning them during this time was just a whole lot of fun.
Awesome. That's really cool. And it's a fascinating product to think about it. And then I also think about the potential for a product like that for COVID and beyond, It seems like there would be so many applications for that for PCR testing.
So tons. Yeah, tons.
Yeah. And so that's interesting. Pocket PCR, there really isn't anything emotionally associated with that.
No,
Then
and it tells the whole story, right? It tells the whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And really sort of being able to assert what's your role and relevance to people with one very succinct statement, with positioning, I think is really incredible. One of the big takeaways for me from your book was the delineation among mothers, missionaries, and mechanics. And I love that language, mothers, missionaries, and mechanics. And I think I've told you this, that one of the books that I read that I grew up with in marketing strategy was The Discipline of Market Leaders. And what he talks, this is Michael Tracy, and this is an older book. And this was previously one of the Bibles about positioning, like the book Positioning was a Bible about positioning. Absolutely. And they're very, very dry and very academic seeming. But what Michael Tracy talks about is there's three kinds of companies. There's like concept companies, product companies, and customer companies. And you have to choose one of those. And, we know in your business, in my business, that choice is hard, right? But I love the language of mothers, missionaries, and mechanics. Could you take a minute to just kind of talk about what's the difference among those different kind of positionings?
Sure. So first, I want to say that the big thing about positioning is it's about sacrifice. So, every human wants to be all things to all people. Every company wants to be all things to all people. And they try to stuff every piece of language into their positioning so that they can express that they are all things to all people. But of course, when you're trying to be all things to all people, you're nothing to no one. So the first rule of positioning is it's about sacrifice, must sacrifice. So when you're looking at so that's the first thing you got to remember. The second thing is who are you? What's your DNA as a company, right? And again, just like human beings, when I was a little girl, my mother made me take years and years and years of ballet. And I thought when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a ballerina, right? So but I'm short and stocky and pretty muscular. It's like, I do not have the body or the DNA for a ballerina, but that didn't stop me when I was younger. I thought, okay, I can overcome this. But as I got older, I realized I don't have the DNA for a ballerina. So why am I putting all this effort into it? It's like Steph Curry trying to be a concert pianist. Why did he do that?
He's got long fingers, and maybe that's the only thing that he brings to the table, but it's better for palming a basketball, right?
Pick it up, right? So the point is, if you're going to be successful in your life, you got to find out what it is you're really good at. What are you really good at? So the same is true with a company. So I did this research. By the time I've done this, I'd worked with hundreds and hundreds of companies, and I was trying to find a way to express how I did what I do. I had a client ask me, how do you do this positioning thing? Because I don't want to pay you all that money if I don't know exactly what you're going to do. I don't want you just coming out of a room and giving me some big idea and that's it. I need to know that
we get the same question all the time. They're like, what methodology do you use to develop a brand, and how can I trust that to deliver a result that's actually going to work? Yeah.
Right. And I'll pay you $5 for your idea, but I'm not going to pay you $200,000 for an idea unless I know what you're doing. So I had to go and lock myself in my office for several days to kind of reverse engineer what I did when I literally did go in a room, shut the door, and come out with a big idea. I called that the ta-da, what that's why my book is called Aha, because really there's a whole process behind it. So it's not ta-da, it's aha. What I did is I took all the companies that I worked with and I wrote them their names down on little yellow stickies and I stuck them all over my desk. And then I started to do a personal manual cluster analysis, like, oh, these companies are kind of alike, and these companies are alike, and these companies are alike. And they ended up in these three piles. And then I started to examine the companies in each of those three piles, coming to terms with, what do they have in common? Why did I put them in this pile? Anyway, at the end of the day, I discovered that one pile was all about customers, one pile was all about product, and one pile was all about changing the world and changing human behavior. So at the time, I called it product-oriented, customer-oriented, and concept-oriented, but because I started to write a book, I had to give them names. So I named the customer ones mothers, because they're very focused on customers. And in fact, they structure their companies differently. They measure success differently. They even talk about different things in meetings. They hire different kinds of people. Those are mother companies. Mechanics, same thing, only they do it all around the product, right? They They measure success differently. They talk about different things in meetings. They structure themselves differently. And then there's the third kind of company, which everyone in Silicon Valley wants to be and very few are, which are these change the world companies, right? They're companies like Apple, like Tesla, like Starbucks, like FedEx, that for whatever reason, they've come up with a vision that literally changes human behavior on a fundamental level. But when you think about these companies and how they operate entirely differently from the other two kinds of companies. They talk about different things in meetings. They spend money on different things. They hire different kind of people. They measure success differently. So once I realized that there were these three different kinds of companies, I was able to then analyze how do each of these types of companies position themselves. So if you're a mother company, you would do yourself a giant disservice to try to become a product company, right? That would be a bad thing. That's like if you're Steph Curry and you say, yeah, I'm pretty good at basketball, but I think I'm going to take up the piano. Same thing. So if you're a mother company, you want to focus all of your marketing on your customers, because that's
what's an example of a mother company that our audience would be familiar with?
So I'll give you an example that everybody knows Amazon, right? So Amazon started off as a product company. I think in Jeff Bezos's head, he was actually a missionary, but what he said about the company, the sacrifice part, is he said, we are an online bookseller. If you remember when Amazon launched 20 years ago, they were an online bookseller. Very simple to understand. Lots of sacrifice there because he knew he wanted to do a lot more, but he just said we're an online bookseller. And he was that product company around online bookselling for a long time. But in the last 7 years or so, and I think this started with his purposeful acquisition of Zappos, he decided that he's going to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And he stated that mission publicly, and it's on their website. So now he wants to be Earth's most customer-centric company. So what's the first thing he does to make this purposeful shift from mechanic to mother? He buys Zappos. Not because Jeff Bezos couldn't figure out how to sell shoes online. Of course he could. He bought Zappos for the customer centricity culture that they were able to bring into Amazon as a company. And then I
wrote about Zappos in, I think in both of my books, and we talk about how Zappos branded love, right? Yeah. And that people are irrationally loyal to this company because of the service, all the way down to when you call their customer service line and you're waiting on hold, they ask you if you'd like to hear the joke of the day.
Yeah, right? I know they were fantastic. Yeah. They still are fantastic. It's very sad that Tony Hsieh passed away, but it was a wonderful company, and what a brilliant acquisition. So Bezos has been steering the company to this customer centricity, but unlike the warm and fuzziness that Zappos exhibited, Amazon's customer centricity is all about using technology to give you what you want, when you want it, exactly how you want it, right? That's what Amazon's motherness is. So they're a mother company, and that's how they do it. They do it using technology, and they even they raise their hand all the time and say, we are Earth's most customer-centric company. So they're a great example of customer centricity. On the product side, to just give you an example, I've had the honor and pleasure to work with Oracle a couple of times, and you might have worked with Oracle when we did.
Yes, absolutely.
And Oracle is a very product-focused company, right? The customer is tertiary to what they're trying to do with the product. They're trying to build the world's best. Now they're trying to build the world's best cloud software. But everything that Oracle does, every company they buy, goes into the product. It's all about the product, and the customer is secondary to that. The customer benefits because it's great product, but it's all about the product. And then, of course, I mentioned some examples of the missionary companies, the ones that are really trying to change behavior on a fundamental level. Starbucks. Who would have thought we'd be paying $5 or $6 for a cup of coffee, 20 years ago? No one would. But they invented this new idea, this third place idea. They invented coffee as a luxury. They invented the language that they use, and the whole thing changed our behavior. And by the way, these missionary companies tend to have CEOs who don't care that much about market research, right? Like Steve Jobs never cared about market research. He was like, why would I talk to a customer? They don't know what they want. Like if you said to a customer in the 1960s, can you imagine a future where you pay $6 for a cup of coffee with cream in it? They're like, no, not happening.
Yeah.
So that's an example of the different kinds of behavior that those kinds of companies do. Just like Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a total visionary. He brings hope to this country, and he is all about changing the world and changing behavior. It's not about figuring out what the customers might want sometime down the future. So
I think this stuff is so interesting, and all of the examples that you gave with the exception of Amazon, the other examples, like these are organizations. It's very clear what they are, and from starting out, they knew what lane they were in.
Right.
Amazon, a little bit different in that they're trying to evolve from being this mechanic company to being a mother company. One of the things that our clients often struggle with is that they want to be two things. Like they always ask the question, like, why can't we be both? Or why can't we be a little bit of all three of these things? We get those questions in branding as well. I mean, it's so interesting listening to you talk. It's been so long since we talked, and that I think about, and Tom in the background is probably noticing this as well. But a lot of the things that you say are the things that I say too. Like if you can't be all things to all people, because if you're everything to everybody, you're nothing to no one. Things like that. I'm like, oh my God, I adopted all of these things into my speech patterns. I must have learned them from someone. It was you, Andy. It was you. So the question that I always get is like, why not two of these, or why not all of these? Why do I have to pick one? Right. And strategy in general, whether it's positioning or it's brand strategy, it's marketing strategy, it's selling strategy, whatever, it is about choice, right? And ultimately, the bigger choice is what you don't do than what it is you do. Right. What do you say to clients when they're like, why can't I be both or all? Like when we do brand archetype work, they're like, we're like the jester hero. And I was like, no, you cannot be that. They're like, we're like 50% caregiver and 70% outlaw. And I'm like, no, you can't do that.
Right. Because here's what they really want to say to you. We want to be all things to all people. That's right. They say we're a little bit of this, we're a little bit of this. So it goes back to the number one rule of positioning: sacrifice. It's about sacrifice. You called it choice, I call it sacrifice, but it's the same idea. You cannot be all these things. And by the way, and the reason is, the book, The Outliers. Have you read Outliers?
Oh my gosh, yes, it's a great book.
So this business of spending 10,000 hours to really be good at something. Okay, I love that idea. The people and the companies who are really great, are the ones that focus on something, and they live it, they breathe it. It's in their DNA. It's everything. The companies that are mishy-mushy, they don't have high valuations, they're the ones trying to be all things to all people, right? So this idea of focusing on what you do well. Again, could Steph Curry be a great pianist and a great basketball player and a great father? Maybe, right? But it's better for him in his career, and of course all of basketball fans, that he puts all of that energy into basketball, not part of it into the piano. So same with me. It was much better for me to put all my energy into marketing than it is ballet dancing, because it's paying off a lot better for me than that ever was going to.
Yeah, I mean, I had a moment where I thought that I wanted to be a concert pianist. I was a music major for like a minute when I was an undergrad. And then I realized that I wasn't that good. B, I had problems with authority. Like my instructor, like she wanted to tell me what to do. And I was like, not going to work. Yeah, so yeah.
I noticed that about you. Yes. I love that about you, actually. I think I think that there's never been any conventional job that was able to contain me. So I had to kind of create my own thing. But that's understanding my core DNA, right? Understanding your DNA and not wasting your career on something that isn't going to make you great, right? Why would anyone do that? I think humans understand that better than companies. But for some reason, companies think, well, I can do all of it. I can be everything.
It's so interesting. And you said companies or brands are like people. I say that too. Like all of irrational loyalty is about this emotional connection and the shared emotional bank account that you have, that a brand has with its customers. And that when you behave on brand for your relationship, you both make deposits into this shared bank account, which sustain you when the bottom falls out. Right. Brands are people. Brands, like they show up with the same hopes, fears, dreams, desires, values, beliefs, and they use them as a magnet to draw to them people who share those same things. While positioning is about maybe the more rational sort of neocortex kind of things, we veer in the branding world. We go deep into the gooey core of the brain, into the limbic system, which is all about giving people the feels. I want to talk a little bit about, these two things. They're different and they're the same, but how do you see positioning and branding being similar and also different?
So I think they are the yin and yang of any identity, whether it's a human identity or a company's identity. They're equal parts, but they're a yin and a yang, right? And the yin is the rational side and the yang is the emotional side. And all people and all companies have both sides, and they're both critical. But again, just like people, I think and I have 2 children, so I've gone through their teenage years, and the best thing you can do for a teenager is to teach them how to listen to their rational side before they act on their emotional side, because I
agree with that.
You just do smarter things when you think about it that way. And the same is true with companies. They do smarter things if they think about their positioning first and then attach the emotional side to it after that. Plus, it makes the emotions so much richer. If the emotions are based in who you actually are, it's so much. It has such a bigger effect out in the marketplace, I think, and can do its job.
When is it important for an organization to think about positioning?
So, somebody asked me that yesterday, and I think the answer to that question is anytime there's some kind of an inflection point happening, either inside the company or in the outside world. So inside the company could be change of CEO, change of ownership of the company, new product being launched, new division being launched, and something big happening inside the company, or
be investment or divestiture.
Any big
maybe launching in a new geography or something.
Exactly. Any big thing that happens inside of a company, or if you haven't launched anything yet, launching your thing, right? And then so that's the most important thing, is to do it at that inflection point. And then if there's a big inflection point on the outside world that you have no control over, like the pandemic, another great opportunity, think about how are you positioning yourself? Because, for example, with this company that I was telling you about with the pocket PCR, when they were basically developing this for sexually transmitted diseases, there was no urgency. There was no, yes, they wanted to get it done. Yes, their investors wanted them to have
it's like probably the oldest kind of illness that will stay with us forever, right?
It's not urgent, right?
Yep.
So they were doing their thing, and they were doing very well, and all of that. But essentially, when the pandemic hit, okay, urgency now suddenly appears. They have a device that they've created that could be super useful with COVID, but they had to make a bunch of changes in the chemistry to make that happen. So suddenly there was a positioning challenge in front of them. Oh my God, like we're not a stealth company anymore, and we're not doing STDs anymore. And now we've got this pandemic, and there's an urgency for tests. And, anyway, big inflection point, time to do some positioning.
That's good advice. I often tell organizations that branding is kind of an always on activity, early, often, and always, because making sure that you are indelibly intertwined with your customers and what's going on in their changing worlds and stuff like that is really, really important. Is positioning something that organizations need to revisit over a period of time? Like what's the shelf life of a market position?
I would say that these days it's probably 3 to 5 years, maybe. So you should look at it, unless there's a big inflection point that happens during that time frame, and then you got to think about it. But yeah, 3 to 5 years is a good time frame. And by the way, what you're talking about with you got to be it's an always on thing. So is positioning, right? Here's the hard part about marketing. This is the hardest thing there is. It's the relentless stick-to-itiveness of your position and your brand. That's the hardest thing. And the poor people who have to do that are the internal Marcom people who are charged with this responsibility of keeping people on the rails. Keep with the same language, keep with the same emotion, keep with the same brand. Companies get tired of these things long before their customers have ever even heard of it. We've got this rule of 7 in marketing. Somebody on the outside has to see or touch your message 7 times before it even registers. By the time you've said that message 4 times inside a company, you're already tired of it and moving on to the next thing. So these poor Marcom people have to keep people on the rails for a long period of time. And that, to me, is a relentless and thankless job that is the hardest part about marketing.
One of the things that I always show whether it's in a speaking engagement or we're, briefing clients or something like that. The company that I worked for before I worked for you actually is the company that does that Brand Z study every year, which measures the contribution value of brand to the overall valuation of a company, and it ranks the top 100 most valuable global brands. I show this chart that shows every year, here's the top 100 brands. And some of the things that I point out are, here are brands that were not on this list 10 years ago, that were dark horses that came from nowhere. So Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc.
Right.
I also like to show it because there are brands that are perennially on this list, like Oracle, SAP, IBM, brands that we don't think about as being like valuable global brands, right? Which speaks to the idea that the best companies in the world, the ones that are the most loved or the most honored, where those emotional connections are the strongest and they're the most consistently positioned. They don't necessarily have to be consumer brands, right? And then I also like to show that there are brands that have been on that list since time immemorial, like Coca-Cola, who for all intents and purposes is a water company now, and brands like Marlboro, who even smokes anymore, right? There's actually systemic change taking place all over the world to get people to stop using their product, but those brands are like worth so much. And it's so interesting to me. One of the things that is the connective fiber of all of those companies that I see on that list year after year after year is that their positioning is clear, it's consistent, and it's singular, like singularity. Like, these are brands that are associated with their categories, right? Salesforce is on the list. And I think about like Salesforce, the de facto standard for CRM, but more importantly, the inventor of cloud software, right? And I think about stuff like that. That clarity of positioning, that it's so clear, Isabel, everybody knows what they stand for. Is there a shortcut or something that you use to talk to clients or potential clients about the benefit of that? Like, I want people to have like a takeaway. So if you're watching this and you can go into your company, you could say like, all right, we need to like get really, really clear on this positioning. What's something that internal Marcom leader or marketing leader can say to say like, here's the benefit of it, and here's 2 things you need to know about it?
Right. So this is why this work is hard, right? This is why we charge a lot of money for it, because it's very hard to get to that, because it's like the Michelangelo thing. It's like, I just see a big piece of rock and I just take away everything that isn't the David, right? That's what we're doing. We see a big rock and we're taking everything away that isn't the position. And removing that rock, removing that stone is super hard and requires like chisels and hammers and lots and lots and lots of time. But I'll tell you just a story about a company that I've been talking to over the last few days. This is you mentioned aviation earlier on. So air taxi is kind of a new thing in aviation, right? We're starting to see some of these companies come out with services that enable airplanes that are smaller jets, enable you to use these 5,000 airports that are all over the United States that are much smaller and a big jet can't get into, and you can do what is called point-to-point travel. So I'm working with one of these companies again, and they shared with me yesterday some work that they had done on what their positioning statement was, and I would say it was probably 8 or 9 lines long, like all these things. For
those who do this, who want to seek this, we are that does this so they can do that. That's how companies are positioning.
That's exactly how they write it. It's unbelievable. And so what I said to them was, and I stole this from Steve Jobs, and I did that on purpose because Steve told me early on that great artists steal. So stealing is okay. So I came up with this line for these guys, and I called them, no, you're not those 8 sentences. You are private jet travel for the rest of us. Like, that says it all, right? It's jet travel, it's private, and it's for everybody, meaning it's accessible and affordable. So you don't need all those words, accessible and affordable and buy the seat and this airport and that airport. Like, you don't need all that. Just say private jet travel for the rest of us. So it's simplifying these things to their core is what is so hard. I guess a lot of writers are credited with that line of, I'd have written you a shorter note if I had more time, right?
Yes, exactly.
Cool, right? It takes time to get something down to just the nugget of what the truth is, right? We talked about truth, the nugget of the truth, the nugget of your DNA, the nugget of what it is that you that you can do. And so I want to say that, and then I wanted to comment on your emotional thing again. So one of the reasons IBM was able to be so successful for so many years is they created not only an emotional connection, but an emotional dependency on IBM, which is the ultimate state of connection with a brand, right? So that phrase, "you never get fired for buying IBM," that was true in the day, right? That was true for 40 years, maybe 50 years with IBM. So that's not only an emotion that it's free of fear, right? Or
Right.
liberation, but they created a dependency. Like, if I buy your product, I won't get fired. Wow, what an amazing connection.
Yeah,
for a brand
safety,
to have.
security, confidence.
Yes.
Yeah, all of those kinds of things. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. And we have a question from Nelson that I want to take in just
Hi,
a second.
Nelson.
He's an old friend of ours, right?
I know, yeah.
But I want to go back to private jet travel for the rest of us. Like, that is so elegant, and it says everything about the role and relevance of that organization. Private jet travel is what it is.
Yep.
And for the rest of us, the role is we're democratizing this. We're making this possible for other people to travel in a way that they're deserving of. And it is so simple and so brilliant. It's very much like the brand promise of Ritz-Carlton. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen.
Right.
Like,
yes.
it just like it is so like I love it, and it's so incredible. And I'm sure you had to do a lot of work to get it down to, just those few words, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, it's knocking away the rest of that stone, because when people put their ideas about what these positionings should be onto the statue, it's like they're pasting it on there with like super glue. You can barely take it off. It's really hard to get people off of this notion of, no, we have to talk about how we sell it, and we're doing this by the seat, and we're only doing the East Coast for now, and we're, it's just on and on and on and on and on. It's like, no, stop. just cut away all that shit. Now, I can do it relatively quickly because I've been doing this for so long, but because I'm force of personality, Deb, like you and I both can do this. You can force somebody to see something when perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise. Mm-hmm. But it is hard. It is hard work. It really is. And then keeping them on that is hard as well.
Yeah, we have a set of core values for my company. Core value number 2 is we do hard things, because the work of branding is hard. All right, we've got a question from Nelson here. He's an old friend of ours. He used to work at Cunningham a million years ago, like we did. And his question is, was 2020 a good year to really reflect on positioning and recalibrate, or should we have just hunkered down? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I when the pandemic hit, I had 4 big contracts in play. And literally, like a week later, they all evaporated, because those were the 4 companies. I don't even remember what they were today, but they basically evaporated. They didn't know what to do. Within 2 weeks, I got the medical contract for that medical company that was making the personal PCR device. And anyway, what we learned is that there are companies who have the chutzpah to reposition themselves in the face of a pandemic, and there are companies that don't. And we've all experienced this. You don't even have to be a big IT company or a big medical company. I got a restaurant down the street here in Sausalito who, when this pandemic hit, they were open for lunch and dinner. They served family Italian restaurant, one restaurant. They served the tourists, and that was it. When this pandemic hit and they had to shut down, they turned themselves into a bakery, into a delivery cocktail service. They sold flowers, they sold masks, they sold, of course, takeout. They negotiated with all the restaurants along the block to use their tables when they weren't open, so that they could serve people that were beyond their geography. I mean, they did everything they possibly could to rejigger themselves for the new time. And God, that's inspiring, isn't it? It's so cool to see people adapt to a new situation in a positive way. And I think so. It's a great time to think about repositioning when you're faced with adversity, the best time.
Absolutely. And we have a great story that comes from my company, just sort of our reinvention and our reemergence, which led to the launch of an entirely new line of business that is going like gangbusters. So, unfortunately, the pandemic fixed some major strategic problems with our business by brute force, which in many ways is good. And like we've reinvented ourselves like over a very, very short period of time. But I previously my entire job was traveling around the world as a professional speaker. And I was booked to be on the road for 7 months with more bookings coming. My very first speaking engagement that canceled was South by Southwest. And I was like, oh shit, here it comes, because everything else is going to cancel. And I, in the spirit of the Stockdale paradox from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, I faced the brutal facts of my reality. And I was like, well, I'm going to be home for a while. What do I do? And then asked myself this question of how can we as an organization be indispensable to people at this time? We shifted immediately into, all right, how can we share as much content with other people with the spirit of elevating them and helping them through this difficult time? What we did was we cultivated this very large, engaged audience that started leaning forward about June time to tell us what they wanted to buy from us. And what they wanted to buy from us was they wanted to buy what my company was doing for me to help me share my expertise and monetize my expertise in my authority platform. And we launched an authority marketing business, which
cool.
Yeah. And within that authority marketing business for authors, speakers, consultants, coaches, I mean, we are supporting some incredible people who are launching new books, who are, that have books that are coming out of the pandemic. We've got coaches. We work with one of the largest coaching organizations in the world that has, I think right now, 150 strategic coaches, and they're growing to 280 in the next year. And this business was something that was born out of a real need in the pandemic. And I love telling that story, but this idea of like facing the brutal facts of your own reality with hope and optimism, asking yourself the question of how can I be indispensable to people at this time through the lens, like what are our core values, and then going. I've seen, in the entrepreneurial community, I've seen so many really interesting transformations. And so my answer to Nelson's question, like, yes, absolutely. 2020 was a year to like re-examine positioning. And like, if I had hunkered down and continued doing business the way that we were previously doing business, I don't think much. No, and I don't think I would be sitting here. And I'll say that 2020 was one of our most profitable years ever. We shrunk revenue wise, but this year I'm really proud because we were very, very profitable, and I was able to pay all of our employees, every single employee of our company, a 13th month of salary as a win bonus for reinvention during 2020. And so there's a lot of companies that have been able to do that.
Yep. And you don't need a pandemic to do that, but you do need some kind of a thing that happens to you. And it's just so inspiring to see how companies can reposition themselves to deal with a new reality, as you called it. And the way you do that, which is exactly what you did, Deb, which was super, super smart. You took a look at the assets that you have that are working for you, and what of those assets can be transferred to this new reality. And not all of them can, right? Only a small number. Only a small number can be. I did the BlackBerry turnaround. I don't know if anybody remembers BlackBerry, but BlackBerry is now an enterprise software security company. I got to work with John Chen on that turnaround. And what we did is we started by looking at what are the assets that BlackBerry has that are going to be relevant in this new world. Because a lot of the assets that they had, and by the way, 46 million followers, social media followers.
I still miss my BlackBerry. Yes. I miss that keyboard so much.
We all do. Everybody loves it. But that keyboard wasn't an asset that could translate into the future. Neither were there 46 million social media followers. That would not translate to the future. So they had a lot of assets. But what were the assets that could translate to the new reality? Mobility and security. So we basically, refashioned the company, redid their narrative, redid their strategy to focus on mobility and security for the enterprise. And they are doing really well. They're now an enterprise software security company. So these repositionings can be super valuable at a time of adversity. If you can think of it, if you can figure out how to take those assets, identify the right ones, and then translate them into the future.
That's really great. All right. Last thing I want to ask you. What are you obsessed with right now?
Oh, do you really want to know? It has nothing to do with work.
No, I really want to know because I'm obsessed with something that's not related to work either. So,
Okay. Well, I am obsessed with losing weight and my health. And I've lost 25 pounds since November 4th. And I mean,
you look terrific.
Thank you. Well, I was never I was never what I would consider to be obese, but I was definitely overweight, and I'm obsessed with it, and I'm enjoying the whole process. And I work out every day for about 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours, and I'm obsessed with it. So that's my obsession.
That's awesome. What kind of workouts are you doing?
I got it started with I was in a terrible river rafting accident a year ago, October, in Bhutan, of all places. And you don't want to be in a hospital there, I can tell you that much. And when
I can't imagine.
When I came back, I found an amazing physical therapist. I was doing a lot of work in New York, so I had to find this physical therapist in New York. And before the pandemic started, I said to her, "Hey, I travel a lot. Would you be open to doing this over some kind of video conferencing thing?" And she goes, "I've never done that before, but I'd be happy to try it." So
that was like more than a year ago. Nobody had ever heard of Zoom, right?
Right. It was early November last year. Nobody heard of Zoom. Anyway, I engaged her, and we do a virtual thing every week. So it's physical therapy as a way of life, is how I look at it. So she works out every part of my body.
There's that positioning right there.
Yes, exactly. That's
you
what
just positioned it. Yeah.
Exactly. Physical therapy as a way of life, which is what it is, because she prevents accidents and injuries from happening. I'm in better shape than I've ever been. And so I do her once a week, but otherwise I run 6 miles twice a week. I do full body workouts that she gives me. I just do them on the floor in my living room here. So, I bought all the equipment, and it's not big equipment. It's things like balls and weights and kettlebells and stuff like that. And that's what I do. So, and I'm really enjoying it. So that's my obsession, is my health. I'm getting older, and I'm a baby boomer, and I'm not going to die.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to reverse the aging process as well. My obsession right now, I'm at my home in Utah. My obsession is trying to ski 100 days this season. You talked about like having a bad injury from river rafting. I'm currently nursing a knee or an LCL injury from a little ski mishap the other day. So like, I understand the obsession with like physical wellness and strength and all that kind of stuff. Well, we are just about at the end of our time. We went way over, but Tom told me that I was okay to keep going because I didn't have anything else on my calendar. But this has been such a great conversation. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think is important for people to know?
Oh, God. No, I don't think so. I think you're great, Deb. I just want to again thank you and tell you how proud I am of all the stuff you've done. It makes me feel super great to have had you at my company for so long, a long time ago.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that. And like, congratulations on all your success. Like I said, like your book is a favorite of ours, and we are using it in our business, and it has impacted probably more people than you even realize. And we don't like give them the book. We make them go buy the book. So, hopefully you're getting some book sales off of our clients that I'm like, you must read this book. You must read this book. And then the other thing I've done is like, I've gone through and I've highlighted certain chapters and certain passages where I'm like, you need to read these things extra closely. My version of it is completely dog-eared. There's another person at our company who, her version is also like lined and dog-eared and folded and all that kind of stuff. And so it's so nice to catch up with you. And it was so nice to have this conversation. And now I understand where a lot of my point of view comes from. Like, you really are part of what formed the me that's here today. And, I wasn't kidding when I said like, irrational loyalty, like it really stems from telling the truth and being authentic and being sincere to what you really are. Like that didn't come from nowhere. I learned that from you. Branding is sex, like came from my experience and working on the Sun Microsystems account. Yes. And also I remember after we would go visit Sun Microsystems, we would go to the pepper mill.
Yes, the pepper mill.
And have drinks and appetizers. Do you remember this?
In the mini skirts who would kneel down, the fuzzy shag carpeting everywhere, and you didn't even have chairs. They were those benches like in a TV room, and they would kneel in their mini skirts and serve you your drink. Remember that?
Oh gosh, it's so interesting. Like life was so much different.
Yes.
Back then, especially for, women leaders in business, and then seeing that, and that was totally okay. Like it was totally okay to have servers in miniskirts kneeling on the floor. And I remember being really grossed out by that and being like, stand up. Yeah. So you wouldn't even see that today in most places.
You would not see that today. But that's how it was. I mean, it was, things were different then.
Yeah.
We've made a lot of progress, we ladies.
We have, and there's still a lot more progress to make. Anyway, thank you so much for being on with me. This was such a great conversation. Hello to all of the Cunningham alumni who are out there watching. Thanks, Nelson, for the good questions and the shout outs and all that kind of stuff. And for everybody else, have a terrific weekend. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, viewers. And we'll see you soon. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.